Subject today is 9 forms of devotion. In Sanskrit, it's often called Navadha Bhakti. That when we speak about love, our love for God and God's love for us, the Sanskrit word for this is often in bhakti. There is love in the heart, but when that love is directed towards the infinite in different forms, in different ways, even as formless, then it's called bhakti. Now, we have this love, and we know that whenever there is love, it gets expressed through our personality, through the way we relate to other people, through the way we do our things. In many different ways, love manifests externally. So how does love for God manifest in a visible sort of way? And we might like to look in our own hearts and see that if we believe that there is this devotion, bhakti in our heart, how does it manifest in my own life? This reference to 9 forms of devotion, it actually comes in 2 different texts. One is the Bhagavata. It is in its present form. The text probably came around 9th or 10th century, although the Bhagavata tradition itself is much older. And another reference to these 9 forms of devotion comes in the Ramayana, when Rama goes in the forest to meet the great devotee Shabri. So in these 2 places, we have this specific reference to 9 ways in which love for God gets expressed. Now, these 2 texts, which have these 9 forms, are not exactly identical, but there are a lot of overlapping similarities. So today, we'll just take a brief look at how these 9 forms of devotion get expressed in the Bhagavata. The story relates to this great saint, well known among devotional texts. The name of the saint is Prahlada. He was a young boy, and so the story itself is quite interesting. We don't have time to go through the whole story, but just the portion that is related to this particular 9 forms of devotion. So Prahlada, it turns out, his father was someone called Hiranyakashipu. In Indian mythology, as pretty much in probably most mythologies, there are the forces of the good and the forces of evil. And so in Indian mythology, the forces of wickedness and evil are often recognized as asuras or daityas or rakshasas. And so Hiranyakashipu, the father of this saint Prahlada, was said to belong to this asura category, the people who are against the divine. So these forces of good and forces of evil. Again, pretty much if you go to the intricacies of mythology, every character has a backstory. And so Hiranyakashipu himself, if you are curious, was one of the gatekeepers in Vaikuntha of Mahavishnu. And then he was cursed for some misdemeanor, and he and the other gatekeeper, they both were reborn as twin brothers, Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu. And then, as it often happens in these stories, eventually they'll go back and get back their original position. So, interestingly enough, Hiranyakashipu had 4 sons, and one of these 4 sons was Prahlada. Not to go into, again, too many details, his twin brother, Hiranyaksha, or sometimes described as his older brother, was killed. He had this challenging duel with Vishnu, and he was killed. And so this Hiranyakashipu was mad at Vishnu. Vishnu is the seen as the part of the Hindu form of Trinity is this aspect of the divine that maintains and preserves this creation. And his dwelling place is called Vaikuntha. So Hiranyakashipu was angry against Vishnu for having, in the battle, defeated and killed his brother. And so he looked upon Vishnu as his enemy. It was not that he didn't believe in God. He believed in the existence of God, and that's why he saw him as an enemy. And therefore, and he was so powerful, this Hiranyakashipu, he had virtually control over most of this, the planet. And one of the edicts he had issued was there should be no worship of Vishnu, no, kind of almost banished the name Vishnu from his kingdom, which pretty much encompassed the entire earth. And so he had this, as his children were growing up, especially this son Prahlada, he had tutors to teach the son. And occasionally then he would meet with his son to see how the education was going on. And he had instructed the teachers, teach him everything that will make him fit to rule the kingdom after me. He'll inherit the kingdom after me, but no reference to Vishnu at all. We don't want him to become spiritual. Because Vishnu is the enemy. So then the teacher would one day, after some amount of training had been undergone, brought him to meet his father. And Prahlada goes to see his father, bows down at his feet, and then his father says, "Tell me, what you have learned?" And then this Prahlada says, "Everything is the glory of Vishnu." All this happened. And father is shocked, becomes and scolds the teacher. "I told you specifically not to teach him anything about God." And the teacher is horrified also. The teacher said, "I didn't say anything. I didn't even utter the word Vishnu." And so after getting some scolding from the king, Hiranyakashipu, the teacher then goes back and then asks this. And those days, there weren't like some books or the internet from which Prahlada could have got that news. So he asked Prahlada, "From where did you get all this?" And Prahlada says, "No, it just came to me. Just is the grace of Vishnu that this insight came to him." And so once again, the teachers then threaten him and say, "No, just forget everything that you have learned," as if it is easy to forget what you have learned once. And then they continue the training, again making sure that he doesn't hear the word Vishnu. A second time, after some time, when he goes back, and once again his father says, "Let me know what you have learned." And it's during that second visit that Prahlada says the insight that has come to him. And that occurs in this 7th book, 5th chapter, verses 23 and 24 of the Bhagavata, which is from which this 9 forms of devotion called Navata Bhakti is something that has come down to us. So let me read the Sanskrit words to you. I'll read the translation after that. Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnoho Smaranam Padasevanam Archanam Vandanam Dasyam Sakhyam Atmanivedanam Iti Pumsarpita Vishnor Bhaktischain Navalakshana Kriyate Bhagavatyadha Tanmanye Adhitam Uttamam, which means listening to the stories of Vishnu, singing his glories, remembering him, serving him, worshipping him, saluting him, doing all works for his sake, being his friend, surrendering oneself. These are the 9 forms of devotion. If one practices these, it would be, I feel, the highest education. So, with all these years of education under the teacher, the essence that Prahlada has learned is that learning and practicing these 9 forms of devotion is the highest education. We can imagine what the reaction of the father would be. He was incensed. He, in fact, then goes on to say, ordering that this son doesn't deserve to live. just kill him. His own son, kill him. And then we have several incidents occurring when they try various ways of eliminating Prahlada, but every time, how through the grace of God, no one can touch him, no one can finish him. And that's one of the ways of seeing how in India, in Marathi language, there is this one saying, Dev Tari Tala Kon Mari. In other words, if God decides to protect someone, then there's no power in the universe which can hurt that person. Shows the immense power of love and surrender when you become virtually invincible. And so, of course, all those attempts to finish Prahlada are unsuccessful. And then it's a big story, and which is why now, centuries later, we are still able to remember and look upon Prahlada as this embodiment, as someone that a role model for what love for God and surrender to God means. So let's look at these 9 forms of devotion. In very briefly, a quick look to see what do each of those forms mean, what do they imply, and how and in what way they can become a part of our own life. Now, in this case, clearly, all of these 9 forms are addressed toward Vishnu, because that is the form of the divine in which Prahlada worshipped God. Vishnu, as in many of these Hindu deities, there is this specificity. Vishnu as someone who lives in Vaikuntha and so on. But each of these deities, they also have the word itself goes beyond the form, beyond the specific personality. And so the word Vishnu literally means the all-pervading one. And so it's possible to look upon Vishnu as a specific form of the divine, but it's also possible to kind of lift it up beyond that particularity and see it as an all-pervading divine. The name Shiva, for instance. Again, Shiva is someone who is a specific form of the divine, seen as someone who resides in Kailasa, and there is this whole theology and mythology connected with Shiva. But the word Shiva also means that which is auspicious, that which is good. So each of these names of the different deities, they also can be lifted out of that context and become as a reference to this all-pervading reality which transcends both form as well as formlessness. And so Vishnu, when we read Vishnu in the text, for all of us, it can be a generic form of the divine. And for most of us, in specific, it can be our own Ishta, our own chosen ideal, the one we pray to, the one who is the object of our meditation. So let's look at these 9 forms. The first is Shravanam. Shravanam literally here means listening to the stories of the Lord. Now we know about spiritual life that really it all starts with listening. Even when we look at how and when spiritual life, we started taking spiritual life seriously. Most of us, in one form or the other, I would imagine, there is this seed of devotion, the seed of spirituality is there in some form. But there is such a thing as a kind of a general piousness, piety, a kind of doing religious things the way everyone does it. And that's good. But at some point, we discover that our connection with religion goes a little bit more deeper. And that's when we begin to take spiritual life more seriously. That it doesn't remain limited to only periodic visits to a place of worship or just kind of observing certain religious festivals, but if something becomes a deep reality in our day-to-day lived experience. And we often will see that if we are mindful, that when did it start? How did it start? It may not always be possible. Sometimes it's so gradual that when this deepening of our spiritual consciousness occurred. But oftentimes it does begin with some words, some insights that we have either heard or read about. Reading, we often don't realize, is a form of listening, because when we are reading intently something, we are actually hearing the words that are on paper. And therefore, the beginning of spiritual life does occur with listening. Now, there are two kinds of listenings. There is a passive listening and there is an active listening. By that I mean, and both, there are ways of understanding both of these. The passive listening is just, we have ears and there are words and sounds outside, and then we hear whatever people are saying. If we don't somehow participate in what we are hearing, then it becomes very passive. And oftentimes in that kind of a passive hearing, passive listening, usually things may slip away. Everything may not stick inside. But there is such a thing as active listening. By active listening, I mean that every word we hear, again, not just through someone speaking, but word we hear even when we are reading, kind of a careful reading, that participatory we start participating in what we hear. We are almost there. And for instance now, many of us read some text pretty much every day. Many devotees do that, and many devotees of Ramakrishna read from the Kathamrita or the Gospel of Ramakrishna. Now, when we read or hear to that text being spoken, a passive would be to just read. Those are the words, we understand the language, we know what it means. But an active hearing would mean that as we read, we are transported back to that time, to that place. Right now, when we read these books, we read about the Bhagavata, well, the events that may have occurred centuries ago. But we read books of Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, events that occurred more than 100 years ago. But when we start reading or hearing them, if that geographical distance from the place where those things occurred and the distance of time, we are now here in the 21st century, 2024, and many of these incidents with Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, occurred in the late 1800s. That gap of space and time, if that gap can go away, I begin to see that I'm present there myself. I'm still hearing it, but then it's no longer the words that are being spoken to those people at that time, then those become words that are being spoken to me. That it's not something that Mother or Ramakrishna is saying it to them, but she or he are saying it to me. That's the difference between passive and active listening. And so Shravana is the first step. We know the three-step way Vedantic study and realization are often described is in these three practices: Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. Hearing, reflection, and meditation. Again, hearing is what comes first. Now, listening to the stories of the Lord would clearly include reading whatever information we have about not just divine in general, but the specific way, the specific form of the divine in which we pray and worship God. We know that when there is love in the heart, we want to know everything about the object of our love. And so similarly, if there is love for the divine in a certain form, everything that we can get our hands on or everything that we are able to hear becomes a source of joy to the devotee. So one way, the first way in which our love for the divine can get expressed is in our unexhausting? Okay, I'm not sure. An unending desire to keep on hearing, And therefore, for instance, now, those who are inspired by the life of Ramakrishna and Holy Mother, and you read Mother's conversations or the book Gospel, you don't just say, oh, I've read it once, and I can keep it aside. I don't need you to read it again. Because we find then we keep on reading, even if we have read it before, and every time we read, because it's an active form of listening, with new insights come to us. And therefore, it's something that can go on for a lifetime. So that's Shravanam. Next is Kirtanam. Kirtanam means singing the glories of God. We know that while reading prose can be very inspiring, but it's music that opens the door to the heart. That's why on all of our satsangs, we beginning and end, we have music. Sometimes through poetry, through music, things can be conveyed, things can be grasped, which even big volumes of books cannot do. So if we are sensitive to music, understand the depth and intensity of poetry, it can completely transform us. And therefore, we find in the tradition everywhere, there are these great singer saints or musician saints. Many of these who found and discovered God's love for them through music. In fact, many of the songs that Ramakrishna used to sing, written by these, among those two names that come again and again in the gospel, are these two great musician saints. One is Ram Prasad and Kamalakanta in Bengal. But in many other parts, not only in India, but throughout the world, we find that the love for God gets expressed through verse and through poetry. And through music, therefore, for those who are sensitive to it, it can be a source of immense joy. And one way that practicing that Kirtanam, for those who have an eye, an ear for music, or those who are able to understand and appreciate music, can sing, can do that singing themselves or play a musical instrument. And for the others, we can listen to music. Sometimes there is something that we may not be able to do ourselves, but we may be able to appreciate when someone else does it. Now, Olympics are going on. Maybe not all of us are, even though we may have interest in sports or athletics, we may not be like an Olympic grade athletes ourselves. But when we look at these games or read about it, we are able to appreciate it. And in some way, in a sort of we are able to kind of participate it in a remote sort of way by just seeing it. So music is also like that. Even if we cannot sing ourselves or cannot play a musical instrument, if we have that appreciation for music, that sensitivity to music, then even listening to music can be very uplifting. In fact, many already do that. Thanks to technology, when you are driving, commuting to work, you can put on some devotional music, and it can be very uplifting. That's the second, Kirtanam. Third is Smaranam. And Smaranam means constant remembrance of the divine. So besides reading and singing, we can even remember the divine. And one way of, probably the best way to remember is through doing japa. Sometimes we know that one way of remembering is through a visual way. And that's what sometimes people do. Sometimes even on their work desk or at the workplace, people might sometimes have pictures of their family, of their grandchildren or children, because remembering is a way of connecting with them even when we are physically away from them. So clearly, keeping a picture of a form of the divine or a symbol that can be with you everywhere you go can be a form of connecting. And of course, hearing the name, you see, if you have a pet at home, and the sooner you call out the pet's name, immediately the dog, for instance, immediately the ears will perk up. And then even the dog, if your name is called out, the dog immediately knows And then so hearing and visually seeing, these are ways of remembering it. Now the practice of japa helps us to do both at the same time. And that's oftentimes how japa gets practiced. Although it can be done in a singular way, that is, either we just hold on to the sound of the mantra, and some would like to hold on to the visual form of the divine. The best way is to combine them both, because we know that, as they say, nama and rupa, name and form go together. And therefore, when we think of the divine in a certain form, the name in which that divine is known comes to mind. When we think of the name or hear the name, the form comes to mind. And therefore, name and form being together, the best way to practice constant remembrance would be through japa. Holy Mother used to say, japat siddhihi, that we don't have to become great philosophers in order to be enlightened. If we can do single-mindedly, repeat the name of God the way we have learned from our teachers, that itself can give us the highest in spiritual life. So constant remembrance can also be through finding creative ways to remember the divine. Because one way clearly, besides japa, is to cultivate what Ramakrishna said is a ripe eye. There is a sense of I in all of us. Now, simply the sense of I is in itself quite harmless, really. I mean, it's just a sense of I. But we don't simply have a sense of I. This I is something that is connected with things, with people, with talents. And so when ego becomes egoism, that can become problematic. It can become limiting. And so when my I gets associated with anything that is perishable, anything that is transient, and Ramakrishna called that the unripe I, because it is connected with the transient, temporary things, the I itself doesn't have that stability. But if I can find a way to connect that I with the divine, with the eternal, then that I becomes strong. So the I that is associated with the eternal, the infinite, Ramakrishna called it the ripe I. So, and then consciously or unconsciously, this I is uppermost in our mind all the time. Not necessarily in a negative way, but every time we feel, this is what I am thinking, this is what I am doing. So without I, we wouldn't be awake, because it's only in deep sleep that this I vanishes. So the I is there all the time, even in our dreams. If somehow we can find a way to consciously connect this I with the infinite and reduce or minimize its connection with these perishable things of the world, that would be another way of constant remembrance of the divine. So discovering our connection with the divine, but also trying to find the divine in the work that we do, in the relations that we have. If I can find a way that no matter what I do, no matter what I think, I'm reminded of the divine. Because sometimes we might think that, well, if I'm reminded of the divine all the time, then I won't be able to do anything. Not necessarily true. If I'm not just reminded of the divine, if I kind of get immersed in the divine to the exclusion of everything else, then I'm in samadhi. And of course, in samadhi, you won't be able to do anything. That's true. But short of samadhi, it's possible to do everything. For instance, now, an example that I have often given in the past is if I have a toothache or if I have a headache. Most of us, if we have a toothache or headache, we don't just sit in a corner just crying, I have a toothache or a headache. We say, well, eventually you try to find some remedy or set up an appointment with your dentist, but you still have things to do. So we go about doing the things that need to be done as best we can, but at no point do we ever forget that we have a headache or a toothache, especially toothache. It's very difficult to forget it, but still we go about doing our things. So it is possible to be constantly be aware of something and yet do the things that need to be done. If it is possible to do other things when we have a headache or a toothache, then it shouldn't be impossible to be able to go about and carry out our duties and responsibilities in life with this remembrance of the divine, our connection with the divine. That is Smaranam, a constant remembrance of the divine. Fourth is called Padasevanam, which Padasevanam literally means washing the Lord's feet. One way in many Eastern traditions, one way to show respect, an act of reverence, an act of service is when a guest comes home, and in the olden days, they just walked and there was a lot of dust around. Even now there is dust, maybe a little less. And so one of the things they always did, that when a guest arrived at home in the olden times, they first offered water to wash their feet. And if that guest is a revered person, then the host said, you just sit down, I will wash your feet. That is what Padasevanam is. Now here, Padasevanam, washing the feet of the Lord, really means serving the divine in devotees. Because one of the ways, again, the way we show respect to the divine is by touching the feet. That's the way respect is shown in many Eastern traditions. And so, since all the devotees offer their respects to God, God's feet are where all the devotees are found. So Padasevanam can also mean serving the devotees of God. So before we experience the divine directly, we can find God in the hearts of those around us, especially devotees, recognizing that serving the people around is as good as serving God. In fact, most of us know that that is the essence of Karma Yoga, that it's possible to worship the divine, worship God, not only in places of worship, not only in temples, churches, and synagogues, but that God can be worshipped even outside these places of worship. And that is seeing. If I believe that God is present in my heart, then God is present in the hearts of every person who stands before me. And so, whatever way I can help people around me, the devotee sees that is an act of worship. And when I do that, that's an act of serving God. All the forms in the world belong to God. Since Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahma, the Upanishad says that whatever we see, whether we are able to recognize it or not, are really the manifestation of the divine. The forms and God can appear in many different forms, in fact, in infinite number of forms. And therefore, a devotee will see that God is present not only inside a temple or a church, but God is present outside in many different forms. And therefore, helping whoever is in need as best we can is also a form of this Padasevanam. Now, one thing is oftentimes people make a distinction between serving devotees of God, and which is a little bit easier since you see that, well, they are also fellow devotees, they are spiritual seekers, and I must help other spiritual seekers. But what about others who are not devotees? People who don't care for God, people who are maybe atheists or agnostics. Should we help them? Should we help the Hiranyakashipus of our times? And the answer is, God comes in every form. And so, even in someone who doesn't believe in God, God is still present. They may not believe it, but a devotee sees God is present in the hearts of even those people. And so, as much as it is possible, we need to help everybody. Having said that, we have to recognize certain differences. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that God is present even inside a tiger, but yet we still need to keep some distance from the tiger. We can't say, well, God is present, and so you know the story about the elephant god and the Mahud god. And if you don't know it, I'm not going to tell it to you. You should read it in the Gospel of Ramakrishna. It shows that even while recognizing that God is present in all, we still need to recognize that we still need to protect ourselves from harmful forces in the world. Eventually, if as much as we can try to help, but also protect oneself. Because if I cannot protect myself, then my ability to help others becomes less. And therefore, we have to be careful in that respect as well. The fifth form of devotion is Archanam, which is ritualistic worship. Now, there are these three forms in which one connects with the divine that are present in pretty much every religious tradition, although it might take specifically different forms in them. One is prayer, worship, and meditation. Again, they may be called by different names, but oftentimes, if we see prayer as a form of asking, which is mostly what it is, that just as when we need something, we go and ask it from a person who can give it to us. So a devotee recognizes that the one person I can go to, the one being who can give me what I want, is the divine. And so prayer can be a form of asking from the divine. And therefore, usually the prayers are answered. In fact, in my theory is that prayers are always answered, sometimes with a no, sometimes with a yes, but they are answered. The answer comes from the divine. So the prayer is a movement from God to the devotee. Now, when we feel that connection, when we feel the prayer is answered, the heart is filled with gratitude. And one way gratitude gets expressed is in a form of giving. And so worship is seen in the tradition as a form of giving. Now, ritualistic worship, the kind of things we give, many of you have seen on the special worships that we have here. We offer flowers and incense and fruits and food. Now, all this offering is a form of gratitude for the prayers that have been answered. So, if prayer is a form of movement from the divine to the devotee, worship is a movement from the devotee towards the divine. These two movements bring the two together, closer and closer. And that's when meditation becomes possible. Nowadays, the word meditation has become such a buzzword that everyone wants to meditate, and that's a good thing. But oftentimes we don't recognize that enough preparations need to be done in order for meditation to be truly a fulfilling practice. And the best preparation for a good meditative practice is to first have this basic practice of prayer and worship. Because only when the heart gets purified and the mind gets refined through the practice of prayer and worship, meditation becomes a more fulfilling activity. Worship is sometimes there is this idea, a ritualistic worship especially, it's a dualistic thing. Because clearly there is some form of the divine in the altar, there is a worshipper, and there are all these mantras being chanted, things being offered. Visually, it looks very dualistic. But that would be a mistake to think that every worship is, just by the optics of it, that it is necessarily dualistic. In fact, it's possible to see worship. Swami Vivekananda called it concretized philosophy. That oftentimes every tradition has a certain philosophy. You can call it theology if you like. Whichever way you term it, it can sometimes get very abstract. And that abstractions of philosophy can become a little bit more concretized, little bit more graspable, little bit more understandable through mythology. And it is these ideals which become concretized in mythology or through history become even more concrete through specific rituals. So rituals can and will take us to that infinite reality. Swami Vivekananda once said that if by worshipping images, if one can become a Ramakrishna, I am ready to worship 1,000 images. So we have to kind of beware of these kind of stereotypical ways of thinking, or worshipping an image, dualistic. I'm a non-dualist. I just believe in infinite. All these are pretty outmoded ways of thinking. It's not about the idea. The way I like to think about it, the most pragmatic ways, just do whatever works. If something that helps you become, first of all, a better human being, makes you become unselfish, loving, kind, opens out your heart, just do it. Just don't worry about the labels. It's whether it's dualistic or whatever istic it is. Just don't worry about it. Just see whether it works. People are different. We have different resonances about the different ideas we hear. Just see what works best for us. There is no time, really, there is really no time to argue with one another or saying this is better or that is better. Just see what works for you and just march ahead. That's the most pragmatic way to go about doing it. Ritualistic worship also, we often don't realize, gives tremendous power. And we need that energy. One of the reasons people find it difficult to focus on the presence of the divine in the heart. The mind is not able to remain pointed at that image in the heart. The presence in the heart is because we lack that energy, that psychic energy needed to keep the mind focused there. From where is this energy come? Vitamins might help, but not only enough. That energy really is generated through a very sincere, earnest practice of prayer and worship. That's why I said that for meditation to be successful, we have to have a good place in our lives for prayer and worship. A sixth form of devotion is Vandanam, constantly saluting the divine. One thing we can do is we can start, it's all right to say God is everywhere. And maybe intellectually we understand it and even accept it. But we must start somewhere. And therefore, we must be able to feel the presence of God, at least in some place. Maybe it could be on an altar in a temple. Maybe not in every temple. Maybe there is some specific place of worship. We just feel the presence of God. And that's already good. Because if I'm able to feel the presence of God in one place somewhere, then there is chance that going forward, I might be able to feel the presence of God in one other place also. That's how we move, but we have to start somewhere. It could be in our heart, it could be maybe in the little shrine you have at home, maybe in a picture or an image, or maybe going to the ocean or looking at the River Charles. We don't know. But if we can find something that triggers and reminds us of the presence of God, then gradually, once we feel that presence, and it's not simply something intellectual or emotional, it's something deep down, we feel God is present. And the only response to that awareness is just a saluting, a bowing down, or Vandanam. One other way that feeling the presence of God everywhere manifests is through a sense of respect. Being respectful to everyone around us. There is nothing in life that deserves our contempt. But by expressing contempt towards anyone or anything, we are really condemning our own selves. And therefore, a devotee, yes, you can, as I said, there are lions and tigers or wild creatures, keep your distance from them. But there is no reason why we shouldn't respect them, because even in them, if it's true, God is omnipresent, then even in them God is present. But respect. So being respectful towards all is a way of preserving and protecting that seed of love for God in our own hearts. The seventh form of devotion is Dasyam, doing all work for God's sake. And that's something we have to ask. All of us have a lot of things to do in life. What is the motivation for my work? Why is it that I do the things that I am called upon to do? When a devotee will say, I work out of love for God. I love, and one way to think about that is that a devotee thinks it this way, that wherever I may be, whatever work I am doing at present, if everything happens to the will of God, God has put me in this situation. God has put me in this place. The skill, the talent, the knowledge, the time, the energy that I have, it's all come through God's grace. And the best way I can show my gratitude, my love, is through using these talents, the skill, knowledge as best I can. And therefore, doing all work for God's sake is another way we are able to connect with the divine. The eighth form of devotion is Sakhyam, translated simply as friendship with God. Now, God is not someone to be feared. And sometimes we use the phrase a God-fearing soul in a very positive way, and that may be true. But we have also to recognize that where there is love, true love, there is no fear. And so when our heart is filled with love for God, the fear of God will completely go away. So God can, and in fact is, the closest friend we can have. Someone with whom we can share our intimate secrets. We know that sometimes we cannot be too sure. You share with someone whether that person will be able to keep the secret. With God, you can be completely sure. There is no virus that can go and open that. It's a very strong firewall there. So God, as a true friend, someone who will never misunderstand me, someone who will never judge me. Although God is sometimes seen as a divine judge, but God as a friend completely understands, accepts us with all of our imperfections, that still God's love for us will never be diminished. We see examples of this clearly in the Gita, the relationship between Arjuna and Krishna. I mean, they were cousins, but they were more closely connected as friends. And of course, the gopis and the gopas in Vrindavan and Krishna. There are many such examples in history and in mythology as well about what does being a true friend means. And finally, the ninth form of devotion is Atmanivedanam, meaning complete self-surrender. Love is a movement away from the ego. And therefore, it's not, as long as I consciously or unconsciously begin to see myself at the center of the universe, there's something wrong with me. When love enters the heart, its I goes out. It's all about you, the object of my love. So surrender is a very natural response of the devotee, because the devotee then knows God alone exists. And if the I completely goes away, and in fact, just to kind of conclude, we've spoken about non-dualism and dualism. Really, both, whether it's in the path of bhakti or knowledge, there is really only oneness. The only difference is in what is kind of gets characterized as the non-dualistic way. One withdraws the mind from everything that is perishable, everything that is outside, all the objects, when only the self remains. Only one remains. Similarly, in the path of bhakti as well, the I of the devotee completely disappears. It's only the Lord who remains. And so there is oneness even there. There is just one. And whether you call that one the self or you call that one the Lord, it doesn't matter, just names. Whether it's the Jivatma or Paramatma, it's Atma at the end of both of them. And all of these, manifesting the love for God in all of these different forms, Prahlada says, is the best education. If we can incorporate these forms in our practice, then we will find that our life will be truly blessed. Now, these 9 forms, and then we have a chance then to look at our own life and say, in which way these forms are already manifesting in my life, or what I can do going forward to consciously find ways to practice this in my own life. Because this is the great kind of a blueprint for all devotees to feel the presence of God in our own hearts and in the presence of God around us as well. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhur.